Thank you for the opportunity to be with you for the Road to Mannheim event. My name is Geoff Mulgan. I'm at the moment a professor at University College London, but I've in the past been involved in many different aspects of social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and so on. As a social entrepreneur, as a policymaker, as an investor. And what I'm going to talk about today are just some thoughts about where we're going with partnerships for social impact, perhaps some of what we've learnt, and this broader question symbolized by this little picture of the fish, of how in any society we learn to cooperate or collaborate, work together, often companies of different sizes, big and small, often working with governments, which have much more power and authority than civil society has. And collaboration is always difficult. It's inherently difficult because of those imbalances. And yet it's also inherently necessary because all of the big challenges we face, COVID now, climate change, aging, can't be solved by governments on their own or business on its own or civil society on its own. So what I'll do is just talk for a couple of minutes each on some reflections on these three dimensions. One, place-based partnerships in cities, neighborhoods, towns, and so on. Then some thoughts on national partnerships and where the model may be going in that respect. And finally, a key interest of mine, which is the next generation knowledge and data infrastructures and partnerships, particularly around climate change and achieving net zero targets. So let me start with place-based partnerships. Here in Europe, we've had many decades of sometimes very successful partnerships of municipalities and business and communities working together on regeneration, often prompted by crises, shock deindustrializations back in the 60s and 70s often led to many of these as unemployment went up and areas were devastated. And a lot, I think, has been learned about how to do those well, the need for a shared mission, the need for the powerful bodies, particularly the politicians, to share power, to be willing to act in a more open, collaborative way with often much weaker, smaller, poorer community groups, and the need for business too, to learn sometimes very different habits. I think it's been clear for many decades, often these work best if there are quite specific objectives and targets on perhaps job creation or physical renewal of infrastructure or social change in relation to schools and so on. And often these do work best with some kind of intermediary coordinating body, which is almost a neutral space where the parties can come together. There's a whole chapter on this history in my book on social innovation, a chapter which is also a bit critical of some of the ideas in this space, and the rebranding of it recently as collective impact, which in some ways captures some of these points, but sometimes also misses some of the crucial dynamics. And I think for almost any town or city, there needs to be some kind of place-based partnership work on these big issues like care for the elderly or, and I'll come on to this in a moment, climate change and so on. It's just part of the way any complex society has to learn to work. And the more there can be openness, transparency, sharing of data and knowledge and people, the better. My second example was an attempt in the UK at a national level of creating a different kind of partnership. This was a mixed success, partly because of the political backdrops, little things like Brexit going on, but I think it was an interesting attempt at a national government creating a formal partnership of big business, civil society and social innovators and all the big funders in civil society and government itself. And it focused on the three issues you see on the left: transitions to work for young people into new jobs, mental health, particularly in the workplace, and financial inclusion and capability. And the idea was to combine commitments by the big companies to what they could do themselves in terms of opportunities for young people or supporting mental health at work, funding for social innovations and social entrepreneurs with promising ideas which were worthy of scaling up, and then the government departments being willing to unblock policy issues and funding which could be a problem. That was the theory, and it was in some ways starting to work pretty well and is being documented well. And I think it's a model for the kind of much more systematic structured partnership we need increasingly on many, many different topics. And in some ways it was perhaps slightly unfortunate it was being done in a UK which was distracted by other things. But again, this should be part of the norm of how modern governments work, and the more precise the targets, the commitments, the accountability of all the players, the better. The third example I want to talk about really builds on what we've seen in the last 12 months. Through the COVID crisis, there's been a sudden innovation of new kinds of partnerships. Some very technological. The top left, you see Taiwan, which has civil society-based ministers often, and they brought together data from business, from society, from government to help them manage the pandemic. Bangladesh, on the top right, also did this well with a collective data intelligence system linking the three sectors. And at the bottom left, you see the scientific collaboration, which has been quite extraordinary. And again, cutting across governments, providing much of the funding for vaccines, the private sector providing most of the manufacturing, but also philanthropy and civil society playing a crucial role too, including in things like Gavi. And if you're interested, IPPO, the International Public Policy Observatory on COVID, which I helped to lead, has bringing together the global evidence on things like care, education, homelessness, and what can be done. Now, in many ways, this is an extraordinary story globally of rapid response to an urgent crisis. But I think it's also shone light on what we should be doing with the equally urgent but slower crisis of climate change. And there I think we've got a much bigger problem in a way. We have had, big advances in terms of commitments, net zero commitments for cities and national governments and many big companies, including a lot of European ones, and a huge shift of emphasis by the finance world and investment. They're still putting much more into fossil fuels than into green technologies, but at least there has been a big shift. The EIB, for example, stopping all fossil fuel investment by the end of this year. But we don't actually have the really structured systematic partnerships of the kind I've just been describing. And there's a glaring gap in these partnerships, which is the digital world. Most of the most wealthy companies on the planet today are digital companies like Google and Apple and Facebook and Alibaba and so on. And they're hardly present in this story at all. And I've been working in the last couple of years on what could be happening in cities, in nations, for much more systematic joint working of municipalities and businesses and communities. But it requires quite a step change in how we think about digital, much more organization of data as a commons, much more structured organization of our knowledge about how to do things like retrofitting and heat pumps. And that simply isn't happening at the moment, even in some of the leading places. So for me, one of the crucial spaces of partnerships for social impact in the next 5 years is to bring in those very rich, very powerful digital companies to show how they can help build a set of shared infrastructures and approaches and methods to help us get to net zero. And again, these have to include precision, serious targets, serious accountability for results. And if that can be done, we're in a much better place to speed up action on climate change. If it isn't done, I think future generations will wonder what we were, why we missed out, and why these incredibly rich companies were basically not playing their part in the most important tasks of our time. So to conclude, yes, partnerships matter. You can't do anything serious on any of the big challenges without partnership. The more structured, the more systematic they are, the more there's really well orchestrated pooling of data and knowledge and accountability for results, the better. If they're just cosmetic, then that does no one any favors. But at the moment, we don't quite have the right structures and systems of partnerships for many of the biggest issues we face in the next few years. So that's something to work on, and perhaps Mannheim can play its role in that. Thank you.